Welcome to our webinar on the Excel transaction loader. Before we get into our webinar on the Excel transaction loader, just a quick overview of a little bit about myself. My name is Errol Killick and I am the consulting manager here at Class. I've been with Class since 2009 and I've got around 12 years of experience in the SMSF industry. So what are we going to cover today in our Excel transaction loader webinar? We're going to have a quick look at some of the basics and some of the hints and tips. We're going to have a look at the portfolio tab, as that's one of the tabs that we use most often. We're going to have a look at how you can automate some of the unlisted asset processing, and then we're going to go through some hints and tips around troubleshooting. Just some housekeeping as well. So we will make a copy of the PowerPoint presentation available to download via the webinar handouts. We'll also be taking questions during the webinar via the chat window. However, we'll be sharing the answers to those questions in a couple of days' time. We'll send you out a summary of every question and all of our answers from this session. We'll also publish a recording of the webinar on our Class education page. And finally, at the conclusion of this webinar, we would love it if you could take a moment or two to complete a short survey on your experience today. Some of the basics and a quick overview of the Excel transaction loader. So where can you actually access the transaction loader? You can actually get that from Class. So we'll just go into Class. So we're at the business level console here. We'll click on transactions. And click on Excel transaction loader. From here, we select the brand. So in this example, we've only got the one brand. If you've got multiple brands, a list of the brands will appear in this drop-down box. You select the brand that the fund is in, and then you click on the click here button, and that will download an Excel transaction loader for you. Just a note on downloading the Excel transaction loader. So I know quite a few of you will download it once and just keep using the same template over and over. We do recommend that from time to time you do download a fresh copy of the Excel transaction loader, only because we do make regular updates to the loader, and a worst case scenario is you go through, fill out all of the transactions into the loader and you discover that it actually doesn't work because it's so far outdated. So just make sure you download a copy of it from time to time. So I'm just going to open up that transaction loader. So here it is here. The first couple of things you should always do, make sure you enable editing because it will by default be downloaded in protected view. And you must also enable macros. So the entire loader is built on macros, so without them you won't be able to load any of the transactions. So I'll just click on enable macros. So what we're looking at here is the overview page, and what you're going to notice is a whole bunch of buttons here. So there is a button, a submit button for each of the corresponding tabs down the bottom here. We'll go into those tabs in a bit more detail later on. And what you also notice here is a little summary of the transactions in each of those tabs. So it will tell you the number of lines, so the number of transactions you've entered, and how many of those have been validated. So the loader's got a whole bunch of built-in validations in place that you must satisfy in order to load those transactions up. We've also got a couple of other boxes here. So we've got the change business and brand code box on the top right. So this is where you can go in and make changes to the business and brand code if you wanted to load the transactions to a different business or brand code. Alternatively, of course, you can just go into Class and download a different loader and select the brand from the drop-down boxes I showed you earlier. You've also got a box for your brand. So we generally recommend that you always enter in your brand code. If you are unsure what your brand code is, then a pretty good guess is jump into that change business and brand codes button and your brand code will be written in there. I'm just going to type that out into my loader just to show you and to install the fact that it is best practice to always enter in the brand code. We've also got the file name prefix here as well. So again, it is best practice to give each file a unique file name, because once those files get uploaded into Class, they will actually they will actually be sorted by those file name prefixes. So it's a good idea to have a unique one for each time you load the loader so that you can tell which file corresponds to which loader that you're dealing with. So we're just going to jump into one of the tabs here. So I'll just quickly jump into the cache tab. And you'll notice that we've got a unique color scheme here. So the first color you'll see is blue, and that's the validation tab. So you won't actually be able to enter anything into the blue columns. They will basically check the corresponding cells for all the mandatory data that's required. So if I just quickly type something into our fund code box over here, you will see that validation coming through telling us that it's missing data. And it's missing data because not all of our pink fields have actually been filled out. So each of the pink fields that you're seeing on this screen are actually mandatory fields. So you must actually enter some data into those mandatory fields. And as you do, the validation on the left-hand side here will update to validate it. So there's also some little red arrows at the top here, and they provide a bit more context around the cells that you're entering data into. So it'll give a bit more information around what is required to enter into those cells. Now, I mentioned that you can enter in your fund code in the fund code column. So the Excel transaction loader does allow you to import transactions across multiple funds, and it's one of the main ways that you are able to get transactions from many funds into the loader in bulk, into class in bulk. Just a quick note, if we scroll all the way down, you'll notice that it is limited to 500 transactions. So if you've got a need to load more than 500 transactions, then you can raise a support query, and the support team will be able to provide you with a larger loader. So as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of tabs down the bottom here, and each of these tabs does have a use case, and they loosely correspond with the event types that you'll find in class. So you've got cash, custom, income, expenses, etc. And each of them do have a use case. So for example, if you've got a download of transactions that perhaps a financial advisor has provided you that's got cash transactions for 20 funds, you could actually use the transaction loader to get all those cash transactions into those funds in bulk rather than doing it fund by fund. Finally, just a quick note on the instructions tab. So the instructions tab does also provide additional information on the field validations and gives you a sort of an overview of what you'll need to enter into the fields that correspond with those tabs down the bottom. Okay, so getting into it, we're going to focus in on our portfolio tab. So the portfolio tab is probably one of the more commonly used tabs, and it's particularly useful for bringing in backfill transactions where a feed doesn't support history, particularly for broker or wrap transactions. So you can essentially load in all of your buys and sells in bulk in the one place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some transactions and show you how to import those into the loader. So I'm just going to open up a trading summary. Let's say that one of our brokers has provided to us. So none of this should be too unfamiliar to all of you out there. Basically what we've got is a bunch of transactions that have been provided for the year, and now we want to load these into the Excel transaction loader. So we're going to start by loading some of the static data, so the data that's not going to change. So I'm going to start with my fund code, and I'm just going to grab my fund code from class. So if I just jump into class and go into the fund, you can find the fund code in a few different places, but I'm just going to go into fund and fund details to pull out my fund code. So I'll just highlight that and copy it, and I'm just going to come back into the transaction loader and paste it in. Now, a quick note with the transaction loader is you should always copy and paste values. So you don't want to copy or Control C and Control V, so just copy straight over, because a lot of the cells do have built-in macros and validations, and if you do copy and paste straight over the top, you may actually break the Excel transaction loader. So we've got our fund code in there. Now we're going to get our holding reference type. So in this scenario, we're going to be loading the funds mapping to a broking account number, essentially. So when I open the drop-down box, I'm going to select account number as my holding reference type. And my holding reference code, I'm just going to go back into my fund and get it from the feeds console. So if I click on feeds and feeds console, so this is the account number that I'm actually going to be loading the transactions to. So I'm just going to, again, copy that and just paste it in here. Now, a note with the holding reference types. So you'll notice that you can also load to HINs, SRNs, and holding accounts. So loading to a holding account means that the loader will load the transactions to a holding account that's already in existence in class. If you want to load to the holding account, first of all, you'll need to change the holding reference code to the holding account code in class, which is typically going to be your ASX code, for example. And you also have to make sure that that asset is already created and active in the fund in class. If you don't do that, the transactions will not load. If you're loading using the account number, which we're doing here, then the transaction loader will actually create that holding account for you in class if it does not already exist. Okay. So we're now going to go back to our transaction summary. And the first thing that, that you should always do with your transaction summary is sort them by the transaction details, so you can split out the different event types, and you'll see why that's important in a second. So I'm just going to highlight all of these and just quickly go in and sort them. So we want to sort them by the transaction detail. I'm just going to click OK, and you can now see that the transactions are sorted by the event type. So we can see we've got all of our buys in a row and then all of our sells in a row. So that's going to make it a lot easier to copy and paste this data straight into class. So I'm just going to copy those transaction details from here. And I'm just going to go into my transaction loader, and I'm not going to copy them into the event type, but I am going to copy them into the description field. So you can see here we've got those descriptions there. So if I come back to my event type, I'm now going to select the event type that corresponds with that detail. So the first one there is a buy of some listed securities. So this is going to be a listed security acquisition. And I know that the next three are the same, so I'm just going to copy that and then just paste it into the next three columns, cells. Now you can see the next one down here is a listed security disposal. It's a cell, so I'm just going to select the event type of listed security disposal, and you can see now why we want to group all of our event types together because it just makes it a lot easier to select our buys and our sells from the event types. So now that we've got that information there, I would typically go in and just copy and paste these fields as well, because they're the static data that won't change. And now I know exactly how many transactions there are. And then from here, it's just basically copy and pasting from our trading summary into the transaction loader. So I'm not going to bore you too much with that. So what I might do is open up a transaction loader that I prepared earlier. So again, we just need to enable our macros. So if I go to my portfolio tab, you will see that these ones have been validated. Just a note with the first transaction here, the first transaction is actually WFC, which is Wells Fargo, a foreign listed security. If you want to load transactions for a foreign security, you must also make sure you enter in the exchange and the trade currency. If you do not, the transaction will not load. So we can see here, if we scroll all the way to the left, that all of our transactions have now been validated. And so now we're ready to load these transactions into class. So if I go back to my overview page, my brand has already been entered, and I've got my 8 transactions and 8 validated transactions. I'm now ready to submit my transactions to class. So I'll click on the submit button. It will ask me to log in. And it will also ask me for my authenticator details as well. And we'll just log in. So now what the loader is doing is it's actually building our XML, so you can see it ticking away down the bottom left here, and then it's essentially injecting that into class for us. So we're just getting a little message telling us that the file has been submitted to the server successfully. So let's just go into class and just check on that, that file. So if I just close out of here. Okay, so to check if my transactions have been loaded successfully, I'm just going to click on the class logo in the top left here. And I'm going to go to transactions and browse loaded files. So this is where you will come in to see whether or not your transactions have loaded successfully. So here is my file that I've just loaded. You can tell it's the correct one there. So when I click into it, we'll see that we've got 8 transactions that we loaded, and all 8 of those transactions have been loaded successfully. So if I just close out of there and go back into the fund itself, we should now be able to see our transactions. So I'll just jump into the match transaction screen, and you can now see that those transactions that we loaded have successfully come through and loaded themselves into the fund itself. Okay, so we're now going to have a quick talk about unlisted assets and how the Excel transaction loader can actually automate some of the transactions that that you might need to process with regards to unlisted securities. So generally speaking, unlisted securities are usually done manually, as obviously we don't get any sort of feed for them. But with the transaction loader, you can actually automate some of the more common transactions that that you may see with unlisted securities. So there is a caveat with this, of course. The caveat is that you must. This would only work if you've got unlisted securities that are held across multiple funds. So if you've got an unlisted security that's held for a specific fund, then there's probably not much point using the transaction loader. But if you've got an unlisted security that's held by many of the funds in your business, then definitely you can automate some of the transactions. So I'm just going to see how you can tell if you've got an unlisted security that is held across multiple funds. So from the business level console, I'm just going to click on investments and go to browse securities. So the security that I'm looking for is called Free Money, and it's just an unlisted company that we've got. So there it is there, Free Money Proprietary Limited. It is a user level security, and if I click on the Holdings tab on the right hand side here, it will actually give me a rundown of all of the funds that currently hold my unlisted asset. So if you've got, if you know that you've got an unlisted security that's held across many funds, but when you go to look for it, you're only seeing it held in one fund, then this would indicate that you've got multiple versions of that asset set up. So you probably need to go in and do a little bit of cleaning up there. So it's always a good idea to try and keep it consistent with unlisted assets. So we know that 3 of our funds hold Free Money Proprietary Limited. So if I just go back into my Excel transaction loader, the first thing I'm going to do is go and generate a dividend for my unlisted company. So to do that, we go to our Income tab, we click on Generate Distributions or Dividends, we type in our security code. So my security code is free money. If you don't know what it is, you can actually find it in class. If you go back to your investments and browse securities and just type it in here. So the code is there, free money. You can click in there and just copy that if you want to. So we'll put that into our lookup. We select our event type from the drop-down box. So this is going to be a cash dividend. We put in the X date. So I'm just going to put in an X date of 15th of August, 2017. We're going to select an amount per unit. So let's just say that this unlisted company is giving us 50 cents per share. It's going to be all unfranked. And we're going to put in a payment date of 31st of August, 2017. Okay, so I'm just going to click OK. And what the system has done here is it's gone and done a lookup, and it's gone and generated our dividend events based on the holdings that we've got in class as at the X date. So you can see here that it's gone and it's calculated all that out for us, and it's pre-filled the Excel transaction loader. So you can now go into your overview tab and submit these transactions straight into class. Now let's assume that this unlisted company has also just announced a capital return. So this is done through the portfolio tab. So if I go to portfolio tab, you'll see there's a little button here on the left, generate capital calls or returns. I'm just going to click on that. Again, we will enter in our security code. We will select our event type. So this is going to be a capital return. We put in a record date. So let's just put in a record date of 31st of August 2017. The amount per share, just going to make it 50 cents again. And then we're going to put in an effective date of we'll just make it the same date. Let's just make it the 31st of August 2017. So I'm going to click OK, and once again, the system has gone and done a quick lookup and calculated out and generated our capital return events based on the holdings that we've got in class as at the effective date. So finally, we're going to say that this unlisted company has also announced a split. So it's a very busy unlisted company. So to generate a corporate action for our unlisted company, we're just going to go into the corporate action tab. Once again, we're going to click on the generate button in the top left here. We're going to enter in our code and then select our event type. So this is going to be a split or consolidation. So what we're doing here is processing a split. We're going to put in our entitlement date. So let's just assume that that is the 31st of August 2017. And then we put in our payment date. So let's just assume that's the 15th of September 2017. I'm going to click OK. So it's gone in and it's generated our corporate action for our unlisted security. There is one additional field that you will need to enter in. So we've got the original quantity in there. You'll just need to put in the new quantity. So let's just assume this was a 2-for-1 split. So if we just type in 20,000 here, 60,000 in here, or 40,000 in here. So again, these transactions are now ready to load up to class. So you can see here how the Excel transaction loader can actually automate quite a few of the transactions for an unlisted asset. Okay, so moving on, we're now going to talk about some of the hints and tips, or some of the more common support queries that are actually raised with our support team, and how to address those. So the first tip is around loading managed funds acquisitions or disposals. So if you are loading a managed fund acquisition or disposal, the event type you select must be unlisted security or acquisition. So if you've loaded the loader into class and none of your managed fund transactions have loaded up, your first call of action there is to go into the portfolio tab and ensure that any security with an APIR code has actually got unlisted security acquisition or disposal. So if this was actually MGE 0001 AU, if that's what the code was, then the unlisted security acquisition event type must be used. Where you've got listed securities, so the next one down here, if you've got a listed security acquisition or a listed security disposal, the code must be a listed security code. So class actually does a validation. So if you had, going back to our free money example, if you had free money entered in as the code here, the event type listed security acquisition will not work. You'll actually get an error. That transaction will not load into class. The correct type is unlisted security acquisition or disposal, because as soon as you select listed security, the code must be a listed security code. If it is not, the transaction will not load. Okay. So we did briefly talk about loading to account numbers and holding reference codes. So if you select account number as your holding reference type to load the transactions or to map the transactions, then the asset doesn't necessarily have to exist in class previously. The loader will go and create that asset for you. If you are, however, loading using the holding account option, and in that case, your holding reference code in this example is going to be MGE 0001 AU, then this asset must already exist in class in order for the transactions to load. The system will not go and create that asset for you. Just further to that, if you are using the holding account to load the transactions, then you must have a brand code entered in the overview tab. Otherwise, those transactions will not load because you can only load to a holding account at a brand level. It cannot be at a business level. Okay. If you do load the transactions and you notice that the transactions aren't flowing through to your fund in class, what you should do is go into your Browse Loaded Files screen and see whether there's been any errors or if there's any issues with that file. So if I go to Transactions and Browse Loaded Files, it gives me a rundown of all of the loaders that have been loaded. So if I go in and have a look at this one, you'll notice that the status is partially successful. So if I click into there, there's actually some warnings. So if I click into that, it's actually giving us an error. So this is a pretty good starting point to try and work out why the transactions have not loaded. So in this scenario, the system was unable to process transaction because the security issue does not support the event generated. What that means is that when we loaded these transactions to class, the event type that we selected here was not consistent with the code that we had here. So we had selected an unlisted security acquisition for listed securities, basically. Okay, the next one is around foreign securities. So we mentioned this before as well. If you are loading foreign assets, foreign asset transactions rather, then you must ensure that you have entered in an exchange and a trade currency. If you do not, the transactions will not load. So that one's quite important because typically the use case is when you load transactions for a foreign asset, you'll select a listed security acquisition or disposal. And as I mentioned before, class does that validation. If you don't select the currency and the exchange, then the system will not allow you to load that transaction. Another common issue that we find is you should always make sure that the account number that you've got in the loader ties into class. Now this sounds obvious, but if you're not actually looking at the account number in class, if you're only looking at the transaction loaded, the broker statement, and the broker statement has got the account number in there, it may not actually tie into what you've got in class. So you should always make sure that the holding reference code that you've got in the loader ties into what you've got in class. And finally, if you are moving funds from one class business to another, and you've received a fund transfer data zip file, you must make sure that you unzip and extract that zip file that you receive, as only after the files are unzipped and extracted will the data start flowing into the loader. That's when the macro actually kicks in and the data gets injected into the loader. If you do not unzip and extract those files, then those transactions will actually not come in and load into class. Quick summary and some next steps. So we have covered some of the basics and gone through a brief overview of the loader. We've demonstrated how to use the portfolio tab to load in some buy and sell transactions. We've showed you how to use the loader to automate some unlisted asset processing, and went through some troubleshooting for when you're unable to load the transactions. Some next steps: download a copy of the transaction loader and start to get familiar with the look and feel of the loader. Enter some data in and load it to class, remembering some of the tips that we've just covered. We hope you've submitted queries during the session. We will provide you with a list of these questions and the answers. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a very short survey at the conclusion of this webinar. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to provide any feedback regarding this presentation and the content.